Today, I'm going to talk about unequal funding for schools in the United States and where these inequalities come from. While this might not be the most exciting thing you listen to all day, it will be informative and insightful. Our Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, said in an interview, "School systems are separate and unequal. If our own Secretary of Education is saying this, there must be something wrong." Well, sadly there is. Students all across the United States going to public school every day will not graduate with the same education. Many students, because of various factors, will never have to worry if their classroom has enough resources or if they're being taught by the best possible teacher out there, but many more students will have to. To help explain the disparity and hierarchy in school funding, I will give you a quick breakdown of how schools receive this funding. About 9% of school funding comes from the federal government. This usually is given to schools through special programs, mandates, or grants like No Child Left Behind, Title I, and English Language Acquisition. Basically, the federal government is doing what they think they can to support state and local governments without completely funding it. The Constitution says that public education is a state right, so the rest of school funding comes from a mix of state and local revenue. Each state has its own state school finance system that is comprised of rules, regulations, and policies on how to finance their schools. Each system has its own definitions of terms like what counts as property and what can count as an exemption. States also have various tax caps. State funding typically comes from an income and sales tax. States come up with a formula to allocate funds to various schools. This formula takes into account the number of students living in poverty, the number of students with disabilities, and the number of students who are English language learners. Most states claim that the goal of their formula is to give schools in high poverty area more funds, but this isn't always the case. Part of this reason is because of local taxes. A majority, if not all, of local taxes come from property tax. This is the most influential factor of unequal funding. Not that many states receive revenue from taxes other than property tax. Maybe school district funding would be more equal if local governments collected revenue from income, sales, or even public utility tax. In New Hampshire, 98.1% of inequality between districts is due to property taxes. Clearly, neighborhoods and districts with high poverty rates will not have the same revenue from property tax as low poverty districts will. This is where the disparity occurs. Education is supposed to be this great equalizer in America, but it isn't. It's a de-equalizer. Students who grow up in high poverty areas will not receive the same quality of education as students who grow up in more affluent districts. Low-income minority students are underfunded and under-resourced. So how does this inequality happen? It is essentially up to the states. States decide how much to tax and how much of that tax should go towards education. If one state is less focused on education than another, they will not allocate as many funds towards the schools. Nationwide, the United States spends on average $10,608 per student, but this varies from state to state. This is the first inequality, interstate disparity. On one hand, you have New York, who spends on average $19,552 per pupil, and on the complete other hand, you have Utah, who only spends on average $6,206. Are young kids trapped with how much we invest in them just based off of where they live? Overall, states that spend the most per pupil tend to be in the Northeast. States that spend the least on students are located in the south and western parts of the United States. The second inequality is intra-state disparity. Recently published in the Washington Post was an article that shed light on the huge spending gaps in Pennsylvania school districts. Bryn Athyn, an affluent Philadelphia suburb, spends over $26,000 per student, while Mount Carmel only spends $8,660 per student. The new governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf, wants to help close the spending gap. He stated that one of the great civil injustices is to say we're going to make your education dependent on your zip code. To raise more money for education funding, Wolf wants to raise sales and income tax and begin a new tax on gas production. This intrastate disparity is due to the state's reliance on property tax. Schools in wealthier districts have a larger pool to draw from. The third type of disparity is intra-district. Inequality in school funding happens within districts, especially large ones. Resources are not being allocated fairly to the schools within the districts. Washington, D.C. public schools exemplify this inequality. This year, Mann Elementary School received $30,000 in at-risk funding, and they only have 2 students who are considered at risk. Meanwhile, Hendley Elementary School only received $208 in funding, and they have 443 students who are considered at risk. Clearly, the funds and resources were not fairly allocated to the schools. Schools that are high need with many at-risk students did not receive nearly enough money to help support them. The school leaders were responsible for deciding how to use these funds, but because of a time constraint, these funds just went to already existing priorities, such as improving middle schools and extending the school day. Intra-district disparity is also in partly due to the distribution of teachers. Veteran teachers with years of experience tend to be in lower need schools, whereas new teachers fresh out of college are in high need schools. Teach for America places college graduates who may not even have a teaching degree into high poverty and high need schools across the United States. Certain schools also receive funding from private parties. At the smallest level, many schools ask parents and families to donate resources. Teachers may ask parents to send in $10 so they can purchase a journal for their student or any other necessary resources. This cannot occur in high poverty districts. Parents and families barely have enough money to pay their bills or even buy food. Many students who are on free or reduced meal plans depend on school to eat. One teacher I worked with told me that one of her students was not excited to go home for spring break because there was no food at home and he wouldn't be able to eat. Sometimes schools set up donation events where they invite families in the county to come and donate money to the schools. I know schools in Montgomery County, in the Rockville and Bethesda area, that do this often. Both of these areas are wealthy, and many of the parents donate large sums to the schools. These schools use these funds for extra resources like iPads or laptops for the students. Technology is a great thing, but at what expense? It's not fair to all the other schools. Other schools in Montgomery County don't even have simple resources like nice textbooks to use. Many teachers also spend their own money for resources in the classroom. From paper to pencils, decorations, to pizza parties for the students, teachers fund that themselves. Schools often give a teacher a budget of $100 to $200 for probably the entire school year. There's no way a teacher can offer a quality education with the allotted amount of money. Teachers don't receive a large salary, so many cannot even afford to spend money in the classroom. However, teachers can write this off on their taxes. The second level of private funding comes from grants. Teachers and administrators can apply for grants or donations online. One website that was recently in the news was donorschoose.org. Here, teachers write how much money they need and what they will use it for. This past week, Stephen Colbert, a famous comedian, paid all of the grant requests of teachers in South Carolina schools. He is donating over $800,000 to these schools to help them fund projects and purchase resources. The next level of private funding comes from foundations and corporate foundations. Billionaires like Bill and Melinda Gates offer large grants to schools, specifically schools in Washington state where there is a concentration of social inequity and poverty. While these private foundations are charitable with their funds and actions, they are tax-deductible donations that give them a good image to society. Corporate foundations like Target and Lowe's partner with schools to give them funds and resources. Lowe's works with schools to give them gardening packs for students to plant and learn science and volunteering standards. While all of the private funding options are beneficial, they are not at all easy to obtain. If you go to a school in a nice community with wealthy families and your teachers are very persuasive and persistent, you could have private funding. But if not, you have to rely on local and state funds. While researching why some schools receive more funding than others, I came across a study on the stealth inequities of school funding. The authors thoroughly researched the school systems and finances of 6 regressive states. This is where high poverty districts receive less money than low poverty districts. Sadly, there is a regressive funding system in more than just these 6 states. In New Hampshire, in districts with 0% poverty, the state and local revenue per pupil is $14,801. But in districts where the poverty rate is at 30%, revenue per pupil is only $9,454. That is a $5,347 difference. Low-income students need a lot of resources and support in order to succeed in school. and they clearly are not getting it. The study said that school funding would be ideal if state funding was relatively equal for every district and the local tax was allocated so that the low-income districts would receive the most, as you can see in the graph. New Jersey and Ohio are two states that are very close to achieving this funding aspiration. The only step back was that these states were kind of forgetting about the middle districts and were underfunding them. School funding has been an issue for many years, but it isn't changing. Yes, governors and political leaders keep trying to implement new ideas and mandates, but they clearly aren't working for every state. As you finish listening to this, I want you to think about funding. Think back on your own school experience. Did you even know this was an issue that is as big as it is? What do you think the government or the people could do to help resolve the issue of unequal funding? What can we do to help our future?